One thing I did want to talk about quickly was Shanghai today. Because China is in a bind. I don't dispute. And China is my subject. I used to be a journalist with the Chinese press from 2009 until 2020. I used to write for the government website china.org.cn, which is the State Council, that Cabinet Office website. It's like the BBC of China. I used to be a journalist with the Chinese media. And I've not been published by them for a couple of years because they didn't like the articles I was posting, and then they basically just said, we're not going to publish these things. So I stopped submitting because it became a bit of a waste of my time. But what is my view of what's going on in Shanghai? First thing that's interesting is the evidential information that's coming out of Shanghai. Of the people tested positive, they went around testing everybody in Shanghai. Some of them 4, 5, 10 times. Everybody in Shanghai got tested, which I think is psychotic, but they did it. Now, when they did it, what did they find? They found that 90% of people in Shanghai who test positive for SARS-CoV-2 with a PCR test are asymptomatic. 90%. Now, that's the highest in the world. All the other countries that have done tests have shown an average, in fact there was 27 million generic tests on people who were not tested because they were ill, but tested because they might be in contact, or there was a testing regime, schools, colleges, workplaces and so on. And they found around 43% in the rest of the world were asymptomatic. Now, how do you explain that double the percentage of people in China are asymptomatic, and yet apparently China got rid of COVID in 2020? I suggest to you there could be two possible explanations. One is people were already immune to it for one reason or another.
Best
And I'll explain
for the
why.
last 30 years, Mr. Speaker.
The second reason could be is that the vaccines in China work. That's the second possibility. However, the evidence from I saw published in the Financial Times claimed that the Cited vaccine, the dominant vaccine in China, which is an inactivated virus, that virus has a lower efficacy, supposedly, than Pfizer and Moderna, except if you had 3 doses, which most people haven't, and then it has the same efficacy as Pfizer. Now, in the Financial Times yesterday and the day before, they were saying the Chinese should take Pfizer now, and that will strengthen their protection. I don't think the evidence is there for that at all. I think, on the contrary, what the evidence points to is that there is some kind of background immunity in China. Now, why might this be? In my knowledge, and I lived in China a number of years, and I've studied China for 30 and more years, the urban population of China has nearly doubled in those 30 years. And that's people who came from the countryside, who grew up in villages, in an ambient full of animals, and connected with wild animals, where people even ate wild animals if they caught them. When I was 1990, when I was in Guangzhou, I remember going around the marketplace. It was like a zoo. There were wild animals of all sorts on the marketplace. Civet cats, which were later blamed for SARS-CoV-1. Pangolins, which at one time were blamed for SARS-CoV-2. Mink, don't forget, they killed 17 million mink in Holland when they found nearly 90% of them had got SARS-CoV-2 positive antibodies.
It shows humanity continues to abuse non-human species.
Of course they do, yes.
And is a case for a new genocide.
But if people came from the countryside and moved to the cities, they would have had all the contact with animals that provides them, possibly with some illnesses, but also provides them through those illnesses with some level of immunity to different types of diseases, less prevalent in the cities. And so I put it to you that the reason why the Chinese population have such a low rate of death and infection or death and illness, severe illness with SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 is because they have some background immunity from SARS, SARS-CoV-2 or similar viruses that have been in circulation between man and animal in the countryside in China for at least 30 years and have moved to the cities and brought those protections and illnesses with them. So that's my theoretical postulation. I'm not saying it's true. It's a theoretical proposition, a suggestion that I can back up with evidence from the dynamics of the migration of people in China. I think it's nonsense. It's funny because I'm being very careful in my wording about what I'm saying because I want this to remain on YouTube. And in doing so, I might change that later, but in doing so, you should take note that the number one fake news story of the pandemic was it was invented by a lab by the Chinese. That's the number one fake news story. And we can prove this because we know that a study was carried out by China's leading epidemiologist, Zhong Nanshan, published on Cornell University website in 2013, which examined children who had been hospitalised in Guangzhou between 2010 and 12, 20% of which had antibodies to SARS. So if they had antibodies to SARS in 2012, 7 years after SARS disappeared, then surely that indicates that there's some immunity circulating in the population and some low-level disease circulating in the population that could provide them with immunity, which might lead to the 80% and 90% asymptomatic in Shanghai. One quick point I want to make. Last week I pointed out that 40% of over 60-year-olds in China are unvaccinated. Now, they took, and I did a research on this last week, there's a Chinese professor, Bo Li, his name is, and he's one of the heroes of the SARS campaign in China, SARS-CoV-2 campaign in China. And he's a Chinese traditional medicine expert. And in a Chinese traditional medicine hospital, they found that a particular type of leaf, they think, has protective properties against SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19. That's a claim by the Chinese because they treated 90% of all COVID patients in China were treated with Chinese traditional medicine. But what is peculiar is that in Shanghai, I saw the figures yesterday or the day before in the Financial Times, only 38% of people over 60 in Shanghai have been vaccinated. 38% vaccination. Now, when Piers Corbyn came here, in May 2020 and organised a protest against the measures taken to lock people down in Britain. In China, they had only just come out of lockdown, and they said they arrested him. Later I was arrested, other people have been arrested. Hundreds and hundreds of people were arrested around the country in Britain. And when we went on demonstrations or came to Hyde Park, the police waded in with batons and attacked us, week in, week out, until we beat them back and defeated them.
Don't vote Labour or Conservative, wake
and
up.
Yet,
they're all traitors.
Suddenly, although that never made the news, the only time it made the news in Britain was when they said, we attacked the police.
Yeah,
Police suffer an
always.
attack by rioters, anti-lockdown rioters, anti-vaxxers have launched violence against the police when it was they who launched violence against us. That was the news in democratic, free press Britain. But if you look in the BBC today, or on ITV, or on Channel 4, or in the Financial Times, or in the Guardian, the Independent, the Sun, the Express, the Daily Mail, they're all screaming. In Shanghai, people are starving and protesting. In Shanghai, people are complaining. A government minister berated in Shanghai. People shouting out their windows in Shanghai. Why is it good to protest against lockdown measures in Shanghai and bad to protest against lockdown measures in Britain. Why? How do you figure that in democratic Western countries we're not allowed to protest and complain? But in
Democracy
China,
is an illusion.
which clearly is a dictatorship, they are welcome to protest and complain. And the interesting thing is the speed at which they protested. It took months of lockdown here for people to take to the streets. It took a few weeks of lockdown in Shanghai for people to take to the streets. Why is this the case? It is because there is a lie in the Western world that Chinese people are passive ants controlled by a government who has them, orders them, do this, do that, and they jump, jump, jump. That is not how China is. China has a militant working class who moved to the cities in the period of 30 years. 300 to 400 million people moved to the cities. Their living standards improved. Their working conditions improved. They became urban citizens. And in doing so, they felt they were strong as workers. They were powerful. They could move from one job to another. They could move from one city to another, trying to improve their lot and trying to improve the lot of their families back home. And that means that the Chinese working class is similar in its psychology to the working class of Britain, France, Germany, Italy in the 1960s, in advance of the uprisings which took place and the protests which took place in the 1960s and the 1970s. Whereas we are in societies that have gone into decline, long-term decline. The consequence of that is the working class have been battered. Miners' strike, defeats from Tory governments, Labour government betrayals, living standards wavering, barely improving. And the consequence of that is a weakening of the organised labour movement. In 1980, about 40% of the workforce were in the trade unions. Now it's about 25%. I'll come to that. About 25%. So I believe that the country to watch at the moment for the dynamics, it's very important to watch what happens in relation to COVID. It's important in relation to world trade and world economics, and world politics, and the conflict in Ukraine. But it's also important to watch how the workers of China move, because the fate of the world will be determined by the way the Chinese workers respond to the regime and the way it behaves towards them. If the living standards are pushed down, if they try to privatise the economy, if they try to sell it off and create a Western democratic regime, there could be an uprising in China by the people against that. And that would place them in command of society, rather than these passive, controlled people that we're supposed to imagine exist. And I put it to you that it is the militancy and determination of the workers that causes the government to maintain a policy called communism or socialism. When they say socialism, they mean we're doing something to improve the lot. Why are we doing it? Because we fear the masses. We're scared of the working class. And that, of course, in my opinion, coming back, and I'll finish on this, why were the lockdown measures dropped in Britain? It was because of the protest movement.
Yes.
And that protest movement...
We did it! We did it!
What was it about the protest movement? Every month there was a protest, the worldwide protest for freedom, it was called. And it became a huge force. All across Europe there were protests taking place. In Germany every Monday night. In Austria, one time after another. Austrians don't normally protest, and yet they had a dictatorship imposed upon them. The unvaxxed couldn't leave home. If you didn't get a vaccine, they said, we may put you in prison if you don't pay fines for leaving home without a vaccine. They abolished that. In Germany, they were contemplating a mandate. In Britain, they threatened a mandate against all NHS workers and imposed a mandate against social care workers.
Dismantling the
And
NHS.
then what happened was a demonstration occurred in which about 7,000 to 10,000 NHS workers joined the protest of the so-called anti-vaxxer, Piers Corbyn and his allies. And that is when the government gave in and capitulated. Suddenly they reported it. They didn't say it was an anti-vax protest. Suddenly it was NHS protest. The British government dropped all the regulations. And then like 9 pins, one country after another dropped the regulations. Because they fear the masses. That is why, do not believe we are not strong. Do not believe we cannot win. Do not believe the power of the people cannot defeat the regime. It is what will defeat every regime in the world.
Ladies and gentlemen, Heiko Khoo, thank you.